Good day! This video will discuss the important aspects of social and cultural settings of spoken and written discourse. This will also discuss the notion of discourse community and the related notion of speech community. Both have an influence on what we say, how we say it, and the language variety we choose in the setting we are in. Also, factors which affect our use of language, such as social class and social networks, will be discussed further. Are you ready? Let's begin! The key notion in the area of discourse analysis is the concept of discourse community. If we talk about discourse community, it is a group of people who share some kind of activity such as members of a club or association. According to Swales in 1990, there are a set of characteristics for identifying a group of people as members of a particular discourse community. The group must have the following: some set of shared common goals, some mechanisms for communication, and some way of providing the exchange of information amongst its members.
The community must have its own particular genres, its own set of specialized terminology and vocabulary, and a high level of expertise in its particular area. The ways in which people communicate with each other and exchange information will vary according to the group. This might include meetings, newsletters, casual conversations, or a range of other types of written or spoken communication. Members of a discourse community have particular ways of communicating with each other. They generally have shared goals and may have shared values and beliefs. A person is often a member of more than one discourse community. For example, someone may be a university student, a member of a community volunteer organization, and a member of a church group. There may be also discourse communities within discourse communities. For example, academic departments may differ in the ways that they do things and the beliefs and values that they hold, as indeed may other parts of the university. David proposed three types of groups of language user. These are communities, collectives, and networks. Communities are a group of people who share substantial amounts of time together in common endeavors, such as a group of people who all work in the same office. Collective are groups of people that form around a single repeated interest without the frequency or intensity of contact of a community. For example, people who are members of a beekeeping group or voluntary members of a community telephone advice service. Networks are groups of people that are not as tightly knit as speech communities, with connections being made by one person who knows another person. For example, connections that are made through email messages sent and received by people who may never have met each other but are participating in a common discourse.
Speech community is broader than the term discourse community. It is also important for the discussions of spoken and written discourse. A speech community in general linguistics refers to any group of people that speak the same language, such as French, English, or German.
There is no theoretical limitation on the location and size of a speech community, which is in practice defined by sharing a set of language varieties and a set of norms for using them. It is not essential, however, that all members of the speech community know and use all these languages or language varieties. They will, however, recognize the conditions under which other members of the community who believe it is appropriate to use each of them. For example, in a city such as Shanghai, most local Chinese will know and use standard Mandarin. People who were born and grew up in Shanghai will also most likely know and speak Shanghainese as well, the local dialect of Shanghai. They know where and when to use this dialect. In some settings, Mandarin may be more appropriate, and in others, Shanghainese. Members of the speech community will know this even if they vary in their command of the different languages or language varieties.
What is a speech community?
Speech community might include social, graphical, cultural, political and ethnic factors, race, age, and gender. Since a person may be a part of more than one speech community, Wardhoff explains that a member may switch from identifying with one speech community to another even in the course of a single utterance. Speakers may not always, however, be full members of a particular speech community. just as they may not be full members of discourse community. In a second language setting, a speaker may participate only to a certain degree in the target speech community. For example, a visiting professor for a semester at a Japanese university and have been invited to give classes in English. He may not need a lot of Japanese to survive for the period of time. However, if he plans to work there as a regular member of staff, it would be quite different.
Speakers often have a repertoire of social identities and discourse community memberships. They may also have a linguistic repertoire that they draw on for their linguistic interactions. That is, they may have a number of languages or language varieties they use to interact in their particular communities.
Holmes explains that social factors such as who we are speaking to, the social context of the interaction, the topic, function and goal of the interaction, social distance between speakers, the formality of the setting or type of interaction, and the status of each of the speakers are also important for accounting for the language choice that a person makes in these kinds of setting. For example, the use of slang among teenagers in Singapore. It illustrates deliberate choice in the use of a language variety to communicate with each other. In an article in the Singapore Sunday Times titled So Steady Pum Pipi, Tan discusses how teenagers in Singapore use slang in their speech as a way of bonding with their friends as well as to ensure their conversations will remain private. As in coining the acronym CCG to mean cute guy, so that she would talk about boys to her friend without anyone else understand what she was saying.
A further factor which influences the use of spoken and written discourse is social class. Social class is, however, somewhat difficult to define as its identification can be somewhat subjective. Factors which may help with this are occupation, education, income, housing, and its location.
Wardhoff states that other factors which may help with the social groupings might include religious affiliation, leisure time activities, and membership of community organizations. A group of speakers may appear to be very similar in terms of social class membership, but differ considerably in their use of language as they interact in the social networks they belong to, and the spoken and written genres used by those networks. Milroy and Milroy's study of social networks in Belfast showed social networks to be important influences on the use of language. They saw, in particular, the stronger and the more close-knit the network and the more solidarity within the network, the greater the influence on language use and the maintenance of language varieties. As Cameron and Kulik observed, the use of language, whatever else it accomplishes, is an act of identity. It means how people convey to one another tells what kinds of people they are. These identities, further, are not natural. They are social interactions. As speakers construct their gendered identities in interaction according to Holmes in 1997, so too do they construct their social and other identities.
Early work in the analysis of gender and discourse look at the relationship between the use of language and the biological category of sex. This has now moved to an examination of the ways language is used in relation to the social category, or rather, the socially constructed category of gender. As Weatherall in 2002 explains that gender is not just a natural and inevitable consequence of one sex. It is rather part of the routine, ongoing work of everyday, mundane, social interaction that is the product of social practice.
Swan pointed out that gender as a social category has come to be seen as highly fluid or less well-defined than it once appeared. In line with gender theory more generally, researchers interested in language and gender have focused increasingly on plurality and diversity amongst male and female language users, and on gender as performativity, something that is done in context rather than a fixed attribute. Lakoff proposed in her book Language and Women's Place what she called women's language, which was said to be different from men's language. This language, she argued, include features such as the use of overly polite forms, the use of question tags, rising intonation in declaratives, the avoidance of expletives, a greater use of diminutives and euphemisms, the use of more hedges and mitigating devices, more indirectness, and the use of vocabulary items such as adorable, charming, and sweet. Spender's man-made language is an example of a dominance approach which sees differences in the use of language as a result of men's domination over women. Tannen's "You Just Don't Understand" is an example of the difference approach. Tannen argued that boys and girls live in different subcultures in the way that people from different social and ethnic groups might be described as being part of different subcultures. As a consequence, boys and girls grow up learning different ways of using language and communicating.
The relationship between language and sexuality further complicates the topic of gender and discourse by adding the notion of desire to the discussion. While gender is something that is socially constructed, sexuality has a much more unconscious basis based on the notion of desire. That is, a person's intimate desire for connection to others that exceeds their conscious control.
Discussions of language and sexuality then take us beyond discussions of language and gender and into the world of language and desire. These desires, further, are not simply private, internal phenomena but are produced and expressed in social interaction using shared and conventionalized linguistic resources.
A person may have a number of identities, each of which is more important at different points in time. They may have an identity of a woman, an identity of a mother, an identity of someone's partner, and an identity of an office worker, for example. The ways in which people display their identities includes the way they use language and the way they interact with people.
The earliest studies into relationship between language and identity were based on variationist perspective. That is, they look at the relationship between social variables such as social class in terms of variation in the use of linguistic variables, such as certain features of pronunciation or the use of non-standard grammar. More recent work, however, has taken a post-structural perspective on language and identity, seeing identity as something that is in constant process, arguing that it is through language, or rather through discourse, that identity is principally forged. Bloomer's words, a lot of what happens in the field of identity is done by others, not by oneself. In some cases, this identity may only be temporary. Thomas has explored the issues of language and identity in online chat environments, a very particular place and space. With a focus on adolescent cybergirls, she examines how girls use words and images to establish online identities, which reflect both their fantasies and their desires in a particular setting. Thomas found out that girls who gain and exercise power in their online worlds are those who know how to use and manipulate words, language, and technology. As Threadgold in 1989 observes, texts are never ideology-free nor objective. For Threadgold, spoken and written genres are not just linguistic categories, but among the very processes by which dominant ideologies are reproduced, transmitted, and potentially changed. In her view, a spoken or written genre is never just their formulation of a linguistic model, but always the performance of a politically and historically significant process. There are a number of ways in which ideology might be explored in a text. The analysis may start by looking at textual features in the text and move from there to explanation and interpretation of the analysis. This may include tracing underlying ideologies from the linguistic features of a text, unpacking particular biases and ideological presuppositions underlying text, and relating the text to other texts and to readers' and speakers' own experiences and beliefs. To wrap up everything, we have viewed discourse analysis from a number of social and other perspectives. Several notions were also introduced which are important for discussions of language from a discourse perspective. We have seen how some of these notions have changed since they were first introduced, such as language and gender and language and identity. I hope you have understood how the said notions are currently viewed in discussions of use of spoken and written discourse in the society. That's all for today. I am Jeric Alvarez. Have a good day.